Hi, I'm Janice.
I'm Darren.
And this is Event Horizon. Today, we're going to start off talking about the response we've had to our first podcast last week. Darren.
Yes, it was a very positive response. We were both really happy with the response. More than anything, what I take away from that is that what interests us interests many other people as well. And that's exciting because it says that while we are facing some overwhelming, challenging circumstances, many people also resonate with the notion that this is also a potentially transformative moment, and that the things that we're following, the trends that we're tracking, not just in a way that to sort of be aware of what we're scared of, but just in terms of watching this unfolding of consciousness happening in the world, in our lives, and as a plurality, as a civilization, are really resonating with people. I also noticed a lot of people really resonated with the fact that we wanted to represent the masculine and the feminine in this podcast. Even when I reflected myself on our experience recording the first podcast and how that related to some of the conversations we've had. And I really liked the way that your way of communicating slightly does change the timbre of the overall communication. That does bring kind of a feminine quality to it that I think is really helpful and does make it somewhat distinct from point of convergence and liminal frames, which is exactly what I was hoping for. So my experience was that it was exactly what I was hoping for and more in some ways. And my sense from other people is that it was for them as well, and it resonated with them. And generally, people seem really excited about where we're going to go, which also means they resonated with the fact that this is an important moment, that they sense it as well. This is a common experience, not just unique to us. But what about you? What did you reflect on, and what did you hear from people?
Yeah, I think I heard a lot of the same thing. It felt like people said we had hit a nerve in the sense that we're talking about they're curious. I mean, it was pretty high level. So I had a couple of people say they're really looking forward to this one, for example, where we start to get more concrete, and we were well. But the scope and the breadth and the tone was definitely intriguing. And the other thing that was consistent across all the feedback I got from friends was that they really liked the way you and I played up, that it felt organic and that it felt natural. And it's because it is organic and it is natural. So that was gratifying to hear, and something I hadn't expected to hear ahead of time. And personally, I mean, I got a lot. You're an experienced podcaster. I've been interviewed, but never been a podcaster. So mostly when I listened, I was listening to your smoothness, and I was thinking about all the things I want to do differently, to be perfectly honest. But I also left I've been waiting for today for several days. I'm like, I'm ready to start talking about, the stuff we're going to start with tonight.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, one of the points to reflect on is that I'm really glad we spent a few months getting to know each other and developing this rapport, learning how each other communicates, developing our language. A big part of this is finding a common vocabulary so that when I say a certain word, you know what I mean by it, and vice versa. And sometimes we've had things we've had to work through in terms of how we might have a preference for one word over another, then we talk it through. And we've kind of got to the point, as we did before we went on the air here, where if there ever is a difference in our perspectives, because we're aligned on so many things, but when there is a difference, we now look at it like somehow those both must be true. There must be some transcendent perspective that includes both of those from a certain way of seeing it. So to me, that's exciting about where this is going to take us as well, both personally as well as the podcast journey. But yeah, so the next thing we wanted to talk about is why this time is different. Why do we have the audacity to start a podcast called Event Horizon? What makes us think that 2024, in this particular historical period, is so unique? So when you reflect on that, what do you think? And what would you say to people?
Oh gosh, so much. And I was just looking back. So one of our listeners wrote in a question just about that. And basically he said, we've been hearing for, millennia that things are going to change. Stuff is on the horizon, the big transition we've all been waiting for. Why now? And honestly, it's the same thing. I remember you and I having this conversation the very first time we talked, if I recall correctly. And I was like, data. We have data at this point, in my mind. I mean, everybody will need to obviously look at anything they track or are interested or think that would be representative, that change is underway, and determine whether they can see that. But for me, it's unequivocal. A geopolitical situation, climate situation. So there's data. That's why this time is different. And there's a whole bunch of different things that I've tracked and you've tracked, but the data is really concrete. I mean, as you and I've talked about, there's at least three possible paths to human extinction that they're not an ideal, they're possible. I mean, look at climate change, look at the geopolitical situation in the world. In fact, what was the article you sent me today about Putin saying today that he's going to test tactical nukes? Those are two. And then we have some pretty dire assessments. If you're looking on the fringe, for example, the possibility of being hit by a CME at some point, a coronal mass ejection from the sun, while our poles are wandering away and the magnetic field around the Earth is degraded. There's just things most of us aren't paying attention to. But when I stop and I look at it and I go down all those different things, because my list is at least 12 indicators long, there's something happening. So I don't know if that's been true at any other time in recorded history.
Yeah, there's something about the fact that, like you say, there's not just one extinction level threat, there's multiple extinction level threats. And first of all, for a large period of our history, we didn't have the kind of technological prowess to be able to destroy ourselves completely. When you're fighting with sticks and stones or swords and spears, or even cannonballs, there's only so much damage you can do. But at this point, we have really moved forward in terms of our technological capacity, but our consciousness has not sort of kept pace with that. So we have numerous options on the table for how we could destroy ourselves. In addition to the ones you mentioned, there's also AI. The fact that we have unleashed this thing into the world, and because of the fact that we tend to chase after technological innovation, we are not really stopping to have a tribal council and ask about what's the best way to use this that would benefit the entire tribe. Instead, we're racing against each other in trying to get there first, and that might create the very scenario that could be catastrophic. And somehow we know this, and we're still doing it. This is part of the collected insanity of this moment. So that really, I think, does lead us to believe that there is something really different about this time, that it feels almost like we were talking before about, like almost like a decoherence going on, like the glue that held the world together in a certain way is coming apart to some degree. And it's more of an energetic process that we are seeing reflected in these different movements that are potentially catastrophic. And again, what's strange about it is that we can all see it coming, but we don't seem to be able to change course. So we're on this runaway train, seeing what could be coming, and yet we're not stopping. And many people feel like they have this loss of agency, like I'm not the one running the train, so what can I do? Some people therefore just want to cover their eyes and not look. These are some of the energetic things that people are having to deal with all of this, in terms of not just the fact that this is going on, these multiple extinction level threats, but they don't feel like they have a lot of agency in it. So to me, that says, yes, this is absolutely a unique time. But we also, like we said last time, not to belabor this point, but the very fact that all of this energetic vortex is arising now also creates the possibility for a really transformative moment where those could come together in such a way that they create the pressure that pushes us in a new direction by necessity. And what we would say is, when we look back at history, it seems like that's how humanity does things. We don't do things in a wise way, thinking ahead, looking ahead, and making decisions. We often wait till we're at that crux moment where we have to make a change. Seems like that's what we're headed towards. But because it is so monumental this time and so unlike any other time in history, it also has within it the possibility of the greatest transformation we've ever seen.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because you and I've talked about that, and I know your listeners know you pretty well, and not me so much. But one of the things about me is that I've studied humans my whole life. And the minute I got in here, because I arrived in the 60s to two very young parents who really had no business being parents at that time, and it was pretty chaotic. So I learned early about human limitation and human capacity and complexity of it, right? Like how we work, about trauma. And then I later went to work in all these intense issues, sexuality, suicide, self-injury. But part of what I did for the last 25 years was to study resilience, connectedness, mental health indicators, social emotional functioning, as well as a variety of, mental health indicators, suicidality, depression, anxiety stuff. So it's been impossible as a scholar in that area not to notice several things about sort of the human organism as a whole, because there's all these ways in which you can look at the body of the corpus of us as a society and measure our health. And, I'm sure there are people who might argue with me, but when I look at the combination of mental health trends, which have consistently, they definitely went uphill in the teens, and probably social media did have something to do with that, and the internet, for a variety of reasons. But we've been heading uphill in terms of the degradation of mental health. We've been increasing that trend for a long time. Low trend rates of loneliness. People aren't having sex anymore. Birth rates are going down across almost every country. Death rates are going up. We have aging populations. The infrastructures are aging. There's, people are talking about being foggy and they can't concentrate, and we're seeing rising dementia. All of these things that, for me, I look at all those and I go, we're not healthy. There's something happening here. But at the same time, and this is where we get back to that, like, it's not all darkness. And one of the, if it were, I don't think I'd be here with you talking about it. That would be just depressing as all hell. It's not how I spend my time. What keeps my attention is, like, there's so much else that's happening alongside all of this. And we both experienced it personally, and I know we can talk about that in a second, but tons of us are having new realizations, seeing the possibilities. And the fact is, we do have a lot of the technologies we need to meet the moment. We just got to shake them loose from the powers that have them, or invest in the creativity that's bubbling up from especially the younger generations. They can see where we need to go. So there's all sorts of possibility. And then the UAP stuff, which has all of this contained in it. So I'm going to bounce it to you at this point and ask you, what is it you look at that speaks to the transformative potential of this moment?
It's a great question. And I think when I was reflecting, listening to you describe the downward trend in terms of mental health and all these other measures in terms of life expectancy, birth rates, those kinds of things, infrastructure, like you say, the degradation of the climate, ecosystem. We haven't even mentioned the number of species that have gone extinct just since the time of our parents' generation. Half of the species on the planet have gone extinct just in the last couple of generations. Yeah, it's a lot. And we actually feel like this is part of a process that we've been called to, that this moment is exactly the moment we were supposed to be in. So try to find that tension there, block that tension between feeling the overwhelm, again, not distracting yourself from it, not just trying to not feel your feelings. You want to feel it all, but then also find a way to see that you chose this experience to some degree, that you're here for a purpose and you have volition in that somehow. You have agency in that. And this has been part of the conversations we've had over the last few months. And people need to find that, can find that. And when you do find that, you look at it quite differently. So for me, that makes a big, big difference. I don't look around and feel like I'm a victim to circumstance. I feel like I'm part of the process, right? So in the same way you described it last time, we are not just going through a transformation. We are the transformation. Somehow the very alchemical process that's causing this decoherence that arrive in all those different metrics you just described also entail all the potential for this change, this really new way of being. And for me, when I really, really tune into it, I don't want to just stumble along like we've been going. I don't want the glue to just cling together enough that we get to the point where we're 90-year-olds and die. I want to live through a transformative moment, and I feel like I've been called to that. I feel like this moment is exactly where I'm supposed to be. So walking that line between feeling overwhelmed sometimes, but also feeling like there's nowhere else I should be, nowhere else I'd really want to be. That's a really interesting dichotomy to experience. What about for you when you think about that particular blend of experiences and elements?
You and I were talking before we got on about, there is the sort of tangible nuts and bolts kind of magic story in the UAP story, and that will draw a lot of people to this topic. And it's good because it's real, everybody. It's real. There's a story. There's so much more than we know. And we are on the precipice of knowing a lot, assuming we don't extinguish ourselves. But it isn't all lost. So there is this interesting story in the UAP world. But I think one of the epiphanies I had recently, I was swimming and I was like, I don't want to feel like this part of myself that has been literally sort of magnetically pulled across the arc of time through many, many really challenging moments for things that, I'm like, why do I work so hard at anything, right? I work really hard. I have my whole life, lots of education and papers, and I don't know, and just thinking and trying to figure out and do right in relationships and do right in the world and have as much integrity as I can while balancing the complexity of this world. And as we got closer and closer to this time, I'm like, get it. There's something here. And then when we hit 2020, as I told you, I'm like, oh my God, it's game on. Something happened starting in 2020. That was January 2020. And once we hit COVID, I knew we'd never go back. But it really changed the landscape of my life in very concrete ways, starting a while ago, but really picking up in the late teens and then early 20s. So I'm my own piece of data in a way. I'm like, what has that kind of transformative potential? And if it were just me, as I said, I would probably go find a place to just be quiet and weird by myself. But I look around and at you and lots of others I met, and I'm like, we're all changing. Something's happening for each of us. It feels kind of very personal, like it fits into people's personal stories, but it's clear. I don't know anybody who's not experiencing some form of major transformation, and it's very deep. And a lot of them are finding these kind of magical skills. They're finding themselves having more lucid dreams or experiences, or just wanting to learn more about spirituality or consciousness or physics or UAP stuff. I feel like that at the collective level and the individual level has been one of the greatest pieces of data. I feel embarrassed about it. I'm like, I'm done. I don't want to feel embarrassed about it anymore. It's interesting, and it makes for an interesting life. And being able to sort of bridge the very, very scary with this incredible set of possibilities that we're looking at that I can't even fathom. I mean, I'm like, well, I have no idea what's going to happen. It could be bad, but it's going to be a really interesting ride between now and then. And that's what I want.
Yeah, I can relate. And I like what you said there in terms of you look back, on the one hand, you worked really hard and you've really been dedicated. And what is it that makes you be that way? Is it because you somehow are more magnetically pulled towards something? So when you reflect on that, because I want to reflect on it in a second, but I first want to ask you, when you reflect on why is it that you've worked so hard? Why is it that your life has looked the way it has? And how you find a sense of agency in that you chose that to some degree, that some higher aspect of you is pulling you towards yourself or a more authentic expression of yourself. How does that land for you when you go from, for some reason I've lived my life this way, to there's some reason I chose to be this way, and in some ways there's no other way I could be?
I have felt from the time I was young. I mean, when I sat in third grade, I sat down to rewrite the Bible. Who does that? I hadn't read the Bible. I didn't put anything on a piece of paper either. But like from the time I can remember like, what am I going to say? I have nothing to say. It was such a bizarre impulse. But that was just one of like many things that were just made my sensibility in being in this world. And my things I paid attention to were always different. So I guess basically fits the data. The only thing that makes sense is one of the assumptions we talked about last time. Like, I wasn't dead before. There is a purpose. I feel very, very purposeful being here in this body right now. I mean, the first thing that came through in 2018 as things were really starting to open was like, oh my God, I get to be in a body during this time. This is so exciting. Wow, I get to watch all these patterns come together. And, there have been moments in my life, I'm like, chickens, what in the hell are you talking about? People are thinking you're insane. Like, I know, but it's really interesting and I value it. Now it starts to make sense, because I do think, given, especially all you and I have talked about related to what the UAP phenomenon is teaching us about what's likely more true about the substrata of reality and physics of reality than we know. Given that reality, I think there was a before, and I am here with purpose. There is a link. I'm not going to die. That's one of the things I try to work when I get anxious. It's just really working with myself around death, no death. But that was kind of long-winded. Let me pass it for your reflections.
One of the interesting things in our conversations is that we partly have a different sense of our histories. Like, I know for you, you've talked about how you've always had this sense of this call. I have too, but in a slightly different way. That what I realize is, in retrospect, things felt kind of misaligned, but the misalignment made sense to me once things began to align and I saw them differently. And that contrast helped me to understand things. And now, rather than looking at those as misalignments, I see them as part of this meandering journey where I needed to pick up certain things along the way, and things that didn't make any sense to me at the time, or made sense in a microcosm, but didn't make sense in how they flowed together. Now they make complete sense. And I know that you and I have talked about, sometimes people ask us, what has your history been? What books have you read? What courses have you studied to get where you are? And can you give me that so that I can also produce the same kind of life experience or life wisdom? And it doesn't work that way because it's custom crafted for each of us. And there's part of this mysterious process where we both sense that somehow it all makes sense and it flows together. But in real time, it feels like you don't know what's going to happen. And you kind of align based on energetic magnetism in terms of what you do next. You have mentioned this time around 2012 to 2015. You mentioned again into around 2021 and that shift. And many, many people, speaking of UAP, have talked about that particular point in history was when a lot of people had their waking up, right? Their awakening, and it being related to UAP, either they saw something or they had a contact experience or something. It's very interesting how the UAP phenomenon has become the mechanism by which this awakening has been delivered, which I think tells us, like you were hinting at, it's more about something in the substratum of reality and less about we're on planet Earth and they're an Alpha Centauri coming here. It's something about this deeper structure of reality coming into our midst and waking us up to something. But like you said, there's also the sense that somehow we always knew this, right? So for me, it's been this strange experience of coming into new awareness, but at the same time, there's a familiarity to it that, like you said, I've always been here. This has been my journey. My journey continues. I feel magnetically pulled to something. And so when I sometimes hear people say, I'm tired of this spiritual journey, or I'm tired of this walk that I'm on, and I'll say, cool, then take a break, But my experience has been, this is what I feel called to do. This is what I love to do. There's nothing else I would want to do, nothing else really that would fulfill me like this, because somehow those things all fit together. It's part of the same thing. So for me, absolutely, there's been this shift that's happened over the last few years that I've discussed on Point of Convergence, I've discussed on Liminal Frames, where suddenly the synchronicity charts went completely haywire. It was off the charts. I felt like something did intercept my life in a way that it was getting my attention. But there's a part of me that feels like that was a deeper part of me getting my attention. So I did make many changes in life. But what's fascinating about that, and I would love to hear after that your experience with how your life changed. But for me, what's interesting is sometimes I hear people say, you really took some chances and you had a lot of faith in the steps you made in really going in a different direction. But to me, that has felt like a relational process where it's like something, whether it's a deeper part of me or some overarching intelligence that I'm connected to, knew how to set the table in just such a way that I could respond. That was enough to make me move on this. The catalyst was sufficient to make me move. And then as I would move, it would meet me relationally, and on it went in this kind of synchronicity storm till we are here today. And that, as I mentioned on the most recent Liminal Frames episode, that has meant that I've met these different people that feel like somehow I was always supposed to meet, maybe in some sense always knew. And that's been true for you too. And here we are recording this podcast, and it feels like that's just the latest extension of this ongoing process.
Yeah, all of that, and then some for sure. There's a lot of people sort of coming because they're having their own experience. And in the process of meeting all those different people and having all those different conversations, I know that it's rare. I mean, the kind of magnetism that you describe, and that I don't think everybody's feeling. A lot of people are sort of reluctant, like it just feels scary. This whole time feels scary. And they don't really want to deal with it. They don't want to think about it. It feels overwhelming. And it becomes hard. It's like you kind of have to wade through some of the intensity of the sort of mortality threat that goes along with this time in order to get to the really amazing parts. I want to say, everybody, keep going, because there really is, this is not just a story of ending, I don't think. But I want to get more concrete just for 1 second. If we were going to start trying to look around and try to get a handle on stuff going on without it being overwhelming, if I want to go look at some of these trends, if I want to go check the data like Janice just suggested, or say things, what should I be looking at? What kinds of topics?
So the one that I'll pick is AI. I have a background in programming, and so I kind of have this dual focus of being really interested in technology, but also understanding the consciousness aspect that undergirds that, and the importance of the consciousness perspective in terms of how we use technology rather than being used by the technology. On the one hand, people look at AI, and right now, everywhere you look, there's these concerns about it could be the end of the world. We think about the Terminator movie franchise, where we give too much power to the machines take over and try to destroy us at some point. Many people feel like that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That movie originally came out in the mid-'80s, I think. And now the concern is that's exactly what we're seeing unfold in our time. I think that's definitely a possibility for the reasons I just described a little bit earlier, in terms of rather than slowing down, working together, having long conversations, balancing all of our priorities, instead we're doing what we usually do, which is create adversarial relationships, and they end up engineering this race to the end to get there first, regardless of what that might mean for potential challenges. That is a problem. And undoubtedly, again, we need to shift how we look at these things so they don't become the worst case scenario. But I want to also introduce some of the amazing transformation that could come about from AI. So, for instance, in the last episode, I briefly discussed how capitalism has seemed like the best option on the table compared to what we've seen happen historically with communism. Has not tended to work out well in the world. And of course, that's most obviously exemplified in the collapse of the Soviet Union. There are many problems, of course, in our system, and that were present even during the height of the Cold War, but ultimately that system collapsed because of corruption within the system and those kinds of things, that the ideals of communism couldn't be adhered to, and that human corruption and human fallibility kind of got in the way. And in that sense, we have found that trusting a market, which is beyond us, external to us, has been our safest bet against ourselves, ironically, which again speaks to a consciousness situation. What I would say AI represents, again, if we can approach it from the right perspective, is the chance to, rather than having to trust some bureaucratic center at the Kremlin or in Washington, D.C., that's making decisions about all these different territories without really understanding the on-the-ground situation of the people in those territories, what we could do is actually feed into the AI all the variables. It could be thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of variables that we need to be accounting for to end up with the best possible scenario across the board for the sake of the greater good. This is the first time in history, again, getting back to this historical moment, this is the first time in history we've had technology like that at our disposal. And if we approached it with the right perspective, again, it could be hugely transformative in a very positive way, to the point where it could fundamentally change our relationship with work. Between AI and robotics, we could largely create a post-work kind of civilization, post-work economy. We absolutely could. But instead, what people are focusing more on is scarcity, concerns that a robot or AI is going to take their job, because we don't think as a unit, we don't think as a tribe. But again, I really want to encourage that part of the solution needs to be using something like AI and the potential it offers us to be able to balance the equation, to consider all the variables that are important for a functioning, sustainable ecosystem that environmental awareness has taught us after all this time. We can take that wisdom we've gained and use that to help AI create a situation that serves the greatest good. And that is the first time in history we've had a technology like that at our disposal. Whether or not it ends up being our demise or the promise of a new future really is in our hands, and again boils down to a consciousness kind of question again. So that's one for me that I think is really interesting, that on the one hand, absolutely there are potential dangers, but there's also remarkable promise as well. What about for you? What do you reflect on in terms of a trend you follow that is both daunting and seems to be overwhelming sometimes, but also has this silver lining of possibilities?
Well, there's actually a number, but I gotta say we have to do at least one podcast on just things you brought up around potential for AI. And this link with, consciousness is going to be essential, right? It's all about us right now. Has nothing to do with technology. It's really us at this point. So that's what I think I actually watched most, are signs of evolution. So just before I get to the big one, I want to just say one of the hopeful signs I see, although again, I think people might question this, is young people. Our children are very perceptive. They're anxious as all hell for really good reasons, but part of it is because they really do perceive the ambient agitation in what I think of as, the field, this energetic field that we're all in, and we're all picking stuff up from, even though we don't think that we are. And then the young ones coming in, the really young ones, oh my gosh, some of them are amazing. They're just coming in brilliant. So it's like, okay, well, the next iteration of us is visible. We just got to make it through this passage. So for those things, there's so much to pay attention to, but I guess the thing that gives me the most hope, but it's also, who knows what's going to happen, is advancements in quantum physics, especially as it applies to technologies that service life. So, for example, it's quite compelling. Those of you who don't follow the UAP build, when we get there, talk about it, you'll see it's very obvious that we have a lot of the technologies we already need to create energy without needing oil. We had it probably for a pretty long time. And the need for it is so present, and it's starting to be picked up by so many different people that there's definitely battles going on in the background. That's pretty obvious if you're watching. So how that'll all play out, I don't know. But boy, if we had, and I think we do have, and we might very well see the emergence of technologies that really could solve, they can't solve the thresholds we've already crossed, and we've crossed quite a few of them climatologically, but they could really help us adapt. Also, as it applies to health and healing. I mean, some of these technologies, as we understand more deeply how humans work at the energetic and frequency level, are already starting to make debuts, and they're just going to become increasingly more complex and available to the general public. So I see all sorts of amazingness. We just got to make it sort of through the next few years here. I overall feel pretty hopeful, honestly. And I feel like, as I said earlier, it's at least going to be a fascinating ride. We're not living in boring times.
Absolutely. And it comes back to what I was saying in the beginning, that it's not an accident of history that we're here right now, that somehow we have to find the reason, we have to find the sense of agency, because it is available. Those things go hand in hand. That's one of the assumptions that Janice and I both operate under, is that we are never victims of history. The circumstances that arise in our lives are somehow catalysts for the evolution of our consciousness. And that's true for us as individuals, and it's true for us as a civilization. Somehow all of that's true. That is part of the quantum magic of the entire thing, is that somehow all those things are simultaneously true. And when I think about this overwhelming sense of these multiple level extinction threats, I think about it kind of like the 4th of July versus a war-torn zone. And you'll hear about people who come back from war zones, and whether it's animals or human beings, can sometimes have their PTSD set off by things like fireworks and loud sounds and bright lights. To some degree, we have to, I think, learn to metabolize and handle the intense energies around us that are something like that, and try to find a way to experience it as something more like the 4th of July and less like a war zone, in the sense that the intensity is large, the vibration is overwhelming, but partly what we want to do is learn to increase our capacity to hold that kind of energy and to perceive it as just energy. So one of the things I talk about in my class is that we experience things and we tend to group them in buckets that are negative or positive. And if it's negative, we try to dismiss it, get it out of the way as quickly as possible, and move back to the positive. And you and I have had many discussions around how the control structures that seem present in our world from certain elite human groups tend to focus on giving us just enough of a dopamine hit that we keep choosing these easy ways of getting that positive feeling and avoiding the negative. But we both recognize that somehow all of that's just information, all of that's just data, and all of it is for our benefit, that anything that happens to us in life is part of the purposefulness of the entire thing. So if we can learn to receive it, metabolize it as just information for our benefit, rather than either taking it in or rejecting it based on whether it initially feels positive or negative, we can gain so much. We can transform ourselves, both as individuals and as a civilization. So that's what I partly hear you saying here, even when it comes to something like the UAP question, right? So many people look at that and go, wow, are aliens going to invade us? Are aliens abducting people and doing nefarious things? That's part of the conversation here. But another aspect that's part of it is all the amazing potential in terms of technologies and things that are coming online. And somehow all of that's connected, right? Like somehow, again, all of these confluence of forces coming together now is purposeful. And the key is to find the meaning in it. Like you said last time, find the strands, isolate the strands that you can follow that take you to a new place. And that can feel overwhelming. It can feel like a path of desperation, but trusting that these things are never random. You're never a victim to circumstance, and trusting that you will get to the other side of that. And I think overarchingly, what we both feel is that there is a transition to something on the other side that's really amazing, that we both feel called towards that. It feels like a magnet pulling us from the future, so to speak. So what do you think about when you wrestle with that kind of tension?
I think you're really good at being able to articulate cognitive processes. So that is very helpful. But I've had to really work with the energies because sometimes they're really, really intense. I don't know how to explain in physics terms what's happening, but I do know that there is a happening. Just living feels different. Time is different. I can feel the energies in my body. So I've had to do a number of things along the way to make this palatable. And I have a lot of people in my life who are very also perceptive energetically. So we've talked a lot about like, how do you do this? And I'd say like, for me, it was like just a little bit at a time. I had an inner voice in 19, I was watching a scary movie and I turned my head away at a part I didn't like. And it said, just don't look away. I was like, okay, just don't look away. But, sometimes it's scary and I do look away, but I just try to do little bits at a time and then do a lot of breathing with the pranayama practices and continually coming present. The mindfulness and meditation practice have been absolutely essential for me to kind of be able to be in the energies and the anxiety that can come up. And mostly, as a human, as a psychologist, I look around and I'm amazed at people's capacity for avoiding it. Blows my mind. Like that's a lot of energy that has to go into not looking over there. And now things are starting to seep into the peripheral view, even if you're working really hard not to see it. Something's going on and it's really multifaceted and it's really confusing, but there's not going to be any place to not see it at some point. So I think, part of what I know drives both of us, because we've talked about this, I feel like part of what I really want to help people do, and I know you do as well, is like, let's just figure out how to be in this together and let's share techniques and let's, we're all having this experience, no matter where we are, what we're doing, we're all having this shared experience right now. That helps me to know that I'm not alone. Like sometimes my life feels like it's careening out of some control and I'm like, girlfriend, it is not just you. I mean, everybody I know is having some wild, crazy eye-opening experience. So that's helpful.
I like what you said there. I think one thing we both want to do is be honest and real about what this process is like. And it's not always going to feel safe. It's not always going to feel comfortable. Partly what we're trying to do is say, like, stay present even when you are feeling that sense of overwhelm. Like you said, the example of watching a movie and not turning away. And something you said there also made me reflect on something we said last time, where there's something about what's about to emerge that by necessity demands that we actually learn to stay present. Yeah. We develop these skills because, like you say, it's going to be something that we could keep to the periphery for a certain period of time, but eventually it's going to be everywhere. And this makes me think of something that Terence McKenna once said in an interview in the 90s, and it was very prophetic, where he said, we're moving towards this transcendental object at the end of time, is the way he described it. And he said that on the march towards that, things are going to get weirder and weirder and weirder. And eventually we're going to have to start talking about the weirdness. And initially we will choose not to. He didn't say that part, but I think that's true. But eventually we will have no choice, because it will not just be in the peripheral view. It will be everywhere. It'll be right in front of us, and it'll be in each of our lives and overlapping our lives. But you make a great point that what that does is it necessitates that we not only increase our own capacities, but we do it together, and that we need to help each other. And partly that is the march I think we're on. We're going from this, again, American-centric kind of view of like the rugged individualism, that we transform into something much more communal, that we recognize that we're stronger together. We're more than the sum of our parts, so much more than the sum of our parts. And this transformation will necessitate that change in perspective, which is what it is fundamentally. And that sets us up for a really new beginning. And I think also what I want to add is that the very confluence of forces that are coming together will also begin to pull apart the old structures that have existed up until now, that have dominated these power structures. Because they've been built on faulty foundations, they will crumble. And that will feel overwhelming. It will look like a storm. It will look like a war zone at points, perhaps. But it also, therefore, promises the potential for a new day where we can rebuild with a new sense of who we are and what we want to do together. So in that sense, to me, again, I focus more on the positive of where this can take us and how much better that is than the way things have been. We have kind of been asleep a little bit about how dysfunctional things are. Like even when I reflect back on my previous decades of life, I realized that that misalignment that always felt slightly off, that I couldn't quite name, was more of an energetic sense. Now I feel pulled towards something that is aligning, that it feels like I'm actually getting an adjustment in an energetic level that feels really positive, and it's happening in the midst of these overwhelming circumstances. So again, to me, what that leaves me with is the journey is going to be tricky, but the journey is not accidental. We're not victims to it. And on the other side is the promise of something really, really different and positively different. So that is what pulls me forward. So speaking of trends that we follow, and something that we touched on in our last episode that we'll weave in and out of these different episodes, is gender, the masculine and the feminine playing together and each benefiting from the strengths of each of them. I know for you, Janice, this has been a trend that you've watched, the topic that you've watched, both in terms of how you've lived your life and what you've experienced as a woman walking through the world that's pretty patriarchal in a lot of ways. What have you noticed in terms of what is shifting, where things do need to shift? What do you pay attention to when you look at that larger trend when it comes to gender?
Oh, good question. And I'm going to stay kind of high level because I know we're going to dedicate like probably multiple podcasts to this topic, and it'll, it's nuanced. But in terms of this context, I do pay attention to it because, first of all, I mean, one of my dominant ways of understanding what's happening on the planet and why it looks the way it looks, an overabundance of yang energy. It's like the masculine is just, it's got to give it a rest. It's like overproducing itself. And we need balancing with the feminine principle. And if you look across all these sort of, cultural stories about this time, and that's a whole other thing I track and that we talk about and that we'll talk about, there's something that matches this moment in almost every story from every culture and major religion in the world. And one of those pieces is that there will be a rise in the divine feminine as a way of balancing the masculine. So I've been looking for indicators of that. It's certainly, as I think we talked about last time, more female leadership, but this is fundamentally a very male-based system. There's a lot of hierarchies of values. So until that whole system is completely changed, it doesn't really matter what gender's in what role. It helps some because woman in a body is more likely to bring more feminine principle just because she's in a body. And we can all think of examples.
Yeah, and I think about what you said there and the different religious messages around this. Even within the UFO phenomenon, we have the case of Chris Bledsoe, who famously encountered the lady. And one of the things that she said, one of the chief messages was that there needed to be a rise of the divine feminine. There needs to be a rebalancing in our civilization around that. And again, it's not about suppressing or canceling the masculine principle. It's about finding balance when the two work together. The famous image of the yin-yang working together is that they seamlessly flow together. They're part of each other. And that's how you create kind of cosmic harmony. And absolutely, when you think about the message he received, it was that the world is going to face some really tumultuous times. And we are seeing that. And what's interesting is then he received those messages. That was years before COVID and things like that. But sure enough, the things that arose that you pointed to, that I remember noticing too, at the end of the teens going into the 2020s, looked exactly like those tumultuous times coming online. Both you have these kind of prophetic messages from a non-human intelligence or a non-conventionally human intelligence in terms of the lady, whatever she represents, but that message resonating for him and many, many people. And when you apply that to the actual real world situation, what you've lived through as a woman, even in being in some positions of power and authority and recognition in our society, you still recognizing some of the disharmony, some of the dysfunction in the system that is very heavily patriarchally focused. I think absolutely this is so key. And for me, I have found that in my life personally, I have benefited so much from experience with the feminine that it helped bring out parts of life that I was lacking. And when you talk there about the masculine kind of overproducing and not knowing how to stop producing, always transactional, always bringing things into fruition, I had the image of like a cancer cell that kind of works that way, right? It's something that gets completely out of alignment with the benefit of the whole, loses its sense of purpose within the global sort of scope, and just keeps reproducing itself to the point where it eventually kills the body. Now, of course, we need those elements. We need generative elements. We need to, like you say, bring things to fruition. But that, apart from balance and harmony and healing and pausing and those kinds of things, get completely out of whack. And so that same thing we see in cancer running amok in a body seems to be happening in our world too. And most importantly, we seem to have lost our ability, our capacity to recognize and diagnose the problem. So what do you feel about, and how hopeful are you in terms of when you look at the world, when you look at the things that are kind of going haywire, how hopeful are you that there are signs that a rebalancing is going to happen?
Well, that is one of the areas where I'm not sure. We got a whole lot of alpha males with a whole lot of big weapons and a whole lot of fury. So this never ends well. None of us can think of any film or any story where this ends well. So I don't know what will happen in the places that it really needs to happen. But I'm going to go, this might be a bit of a political statement in some places, but after all of the research that I've done, and both, my personal life and my work life, and I don't know, my whole life. I started out as a sex educator. Like, it's just this idea of stuff around gender and sex and power and all this stuff has just been part of the landscape I've walked in for many years. I've come to conclude that I think the men of our society have been the most egregiously wounded. And I say that because I think that I know a lot of men who really want they want to have connection to that yin energy, and they seek it outside themselves mostly, right? But they need it inside. Like, I can access my male energy pretty easily, but I don't know many men who can access their feminine energy without feeling, well, they have to wade through all sorts of stuff they've just not been able to or willing to, and the collective of men are just like super ashamed to do it. But it's like, wow, to reconnect the heart and the head, in a way, I feel like I look around, I'm like, I think it got severed. I think it was probably purposeful. It's been going on for a really long time. Maybe not severed, just winnowed down super thin. That's the alchemy I'm waiting to happen. Where do I see the masculine starting to integrate the feminine? Because that's painful. I can see that it's painful. And there's lots of reasons, lots of things, like it's not going to be an easy process, but my heart goes out to them. I know so many men that I love, and I have lived under the limitations. Like, I've had to live their limitations, because they didn't have full access to their heart and their capacity for empathy and their intuition and their relational knowing. And, so I don't know. When I look at that, I'm like, I think it's starting. The fact that, you've even been willing to have some of these conversations is good. That's really good. I am meeting more men who are definitely in the process. I'm super psyched about that. We'll see if it, keeps us from extinction. I don't know yet. That jury's out on that one. But I'm loving that we get to be at the point where we start to have these conversations. Anyway, that was kind of a long-winded way of answering your question, but I'm wondering, as a man, what do you think?
Well, one thing that I reflect on when I hear you speak about that is that I think one thing we would want to communicate to men, that I would want to communicate to men, is that it's not just about blaming. It's not about saying that you just need to be different, because I think many men, like you say, don't know quite how to tap into that part of themselves. And yet we would say that any fully healthy and well-developed human being has both aspects in their persona. And partly why men have been in some ways controlled is that they've lost their sense of energetic connection. They've lost this emotional core that when they were young boys, they often were taught, either explicitly or implicitly, that it's not okay to express your emotions, that you should be very thin or hollow or one-dimensional in terms of your emotional expression. And so that not only changes your expression, but it basically, that environment stunted their growth. Many men as boys were cut off from that. I even think about my own ancestral history, and I come from a bunch of British men. And my dad himself has shared with me more recently, he didn't talk about this when I was younger, but more recently he's talked about what it was like when he was a young boy, and his biological father came back from World War II and was really messed up with the war, which was, again, driven by male energy that wanted to dominate and take over land. And so people had to send off their sons to die in this horrific kind of situation. So he had the experience of his dad coming back, being really messed up because of what he experienced. And then him and his mom getting divorced and him being separated from his brother, his full-blood brother, didn't grow up with his full-blood brother at all. And then often had to sit at home alone while his mom went out to work. And he wasn't in kind of an emotionally enriching environment where he could learn to express his emotions. And so when I sometimes have conversations with him now, I sense that he's just beginning to explore these parts of himself that he didn't get a chance to explore back then. So this is something that has been unfortunate about men's history. So this is not about blaming men. It's about recognizing that whatever forces have put us in the scenario we're in have damaged men as much as they've damaged women. So it's about making men healthy. Again, it's about both sexes, both genders finding ways to manifest both the masculine and the feminine principle in healthy ways. And only when that happens will we become the world we need to be. And to your point, I just want to add, when you say that it looks pretty dire in terms of, are these power brokers that are driven by this masculine energy going to stop? Are they going to come to awareness? We don't know. Again, it may be that an excessive expression of that energy causes some sort of collapse or some sort of deterioration, that in the ashes of that, we regenerate. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like. The way the cosmos tends to work is that things eventually rebalance themselves. This is what life does at the micro and the macro, and we are part of that process in real time. And the more we can get in alignment with that and live from those principles, the closer we will be to that future.
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, I think we are collectively coming to a point of where the idea of sending children off to war, no way, just no. Think about what men have to do and boys have to do. Boys, really, in order to become that, somebody who could kill, it's violently awful to experience. And I think, what are we doing? No. It's not just an idea, like we're living it. And I think that's part of the energetic momentum I was talking about earlier. The fact that we're having this conversation, the fact that your father is starting now. I mean, most men I know were in his generation died without even beginning that process. The fact that he feels like he can, wow, that does say something about where we're at, right? It really does. I think we are in motion. It is happening. And to any men listening, I would just say, I know this is really hard. I feel like what men are being asked to do right now, if you incarnated, from my perspective, in a male body, you took on, and you're listening to this podcast, you're one of those guys who took on a lot to help us balance this. And it is not easy to be a man at this moment. I know, I can feel it. I know it, but it's so worth it. It's so worth it. This journey does take courage. It's just that what you open into as things start to blend, as those energies sort of come back into balance inside each of us, is so worthwhile. One of the feminine principles I think that is so necessary in this time for all of us is the feminine naturally tends to know how to connect. We tend to and befriend. When we're stressed, we don't tend to isolate like men do. We tend to reach out. And that is exactly what needs to happen in this moment for humanity to make this passage, right? So it's like that's part of the feminine principle that needs to be incorporated everywhere. And I know a dozen men, easy, who would really welcome that. Some of them don't really know how to make it happen and how to be comfortable with it. But you know, I know that there's a lot of guys who are ready. So I'm very excited about being a part of that process.
Right. And in light of this particular part of the conversation around gender and these energies, I'm sure for a lot of people, this is triggering to some degree, both men and women who reflect on their experience and feel like a lot of negative reactions are rising in their body. We just want to say again, along the lines of what we said at the beginning, learn to sit with that energy, learn to be with it. Don't distract yourself. Don't turn away. There's promise there. There's the potential for transformation there. We'll continue to have this conversation. Again, it's not about anybody being at fault. It's about recognizing how we can come together, how we can both benefit from both the masculine and the feminine principle working together. We will all be better for it. We will be more harmoniously moving forward as a civilization.
I have 3 quick things to add. 1, women have their own work. Don't feel like guys are just doing the work. Women have got their own work. It's just different. We'll talk about that another time. 2, Pema Chodron talks about the 3 breath rule, which I love. If it's hard, just breathe next to it. 3 full breaths. Don't talk to it. Don't talk about it. Don't think, just sit there with it. At the 3rd breath, go on with your day. If you want to avoid it, then go. It does really work. It's pretty amazing. And 3, we really are in this together. This is an us thing. And it's happening to every one of us. Nobody did anything wrong. It's just we're like, now how do we get out of this pickle collectively?
And exactly. And that's why I would, again, bring us back to something we said at the beginning, is that it's the very pressures that we're feeling that carry the possibility for transformation, that it, again, necessitates that. And the last thing I'll add as a technique, in addition to what Janice is saying, or a way to think about this and how the transformation begins to happen, is just by sitting with the energy a little bit longer, including using breath work to do that, begins to transform it. Sometimes people feel overwhelmed by, how do I do this? How do I work with this energy? How do I talk to it? It takes taking these 2 energies, the history has been and this future you're imagining, and just letting the 2 sit together. They begin to blend. The energy begins to change just by bringing attention and awareness to it. So process is already underway. That's the good news in all of this.
And that's the yin principle of allowing. And Eckhart Tolle talks a lot about this, and I love it because it's so true. The minute you just see it, you acknowledge its existence, it begins to change. You don't have to do anything about it. You don't have to act on it. You don't have to figure it out. Just allow it. It's cool. Give it a try. And you don't have to stay forever. Just, a little bit longer, just as Darren just said, a little bit longer than usual.
Absolutely. Totally agreed. And again, I think we're already exemplifying in some of what we discussed today, how the very pressures also present the possibilities and even the way forward. That's what's involved here.
Yeah. And actually, you just made me think, like, perfect timing, right? Because for next week, we're going to be talking a little bit about the nature of reality or how to view reality in a slightly different way. But I think my pet theory, I don't know that I could ever prove it or we'll see, but my pet theory is that part of the reason things are decohering, they're deconstructing, is because we, the collective, are withdrawing our attention from them. We don't want it anymore. We want to create something different. We're yearning for something different, and like deep in our souls, we want a world that supports life and supports the expression of life. There's a lot of things we want. So it is the result, I think, of that yearning, that wanting, that may, we're going to talk, quantum, may actually be contributing to where we are. And the opportunity then becomes, well, what else do we want to see there? What else do we want to create in there? And yeah, I think we talked about this last time. So maybe think about it, and you're sitting at the light. Throw something in the pot of where we want to go, and let's see if that'll shift the landscape of reality. And next time we'll talk about different ways to think about that fabric of reality that might be a little more permeable and a little less fixed than it has made out to be.
And that's going to do it for this particular edition. We hope you'll tune in again in 2 weeks' time for another edition of Event Horizon.